What if I told you that some of the plants sold in ordinary garden centers can quietly destroy your yard, your flower beds, even your driveway? They start small, beautiful, harmless looking. The kind of plant that makes you stop and think, that would look perfect in my garden. But a few years later, those same plants can take over everything. Roots creeping under fences, shoots popping up across the lawn, vines climbing houses and trees, and suddenly the garden you loved becomes a fight you never expected. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what's the #1 plant you're hoping to grow this year? Because today we're going to talk about something many gardeners learn the hard way. Not the plants you should grow, the plants you should be very careful about planting. Some of these species look innocent, some are even recommended in magazines, and a few are so aggressive that entire countries now spend millions trying to remove them. By the end of this video, you'll know which popular plants can spread underground like an invasion, which ones slowly suffocate trees, and which one actually releases chemicals that poison the soil around it. And near the end, I'll show you one plant that can spread so aggressively that mortgage lenders in some regions literally warn homeowners about it before they buy a property. If you're building a garden meant to feed your family, survive tough times, or simply stay manageable as you get older, knowing what not to plant might be just as important as knowing what to grow. Because the truth is simple, a garden should give you peace, not a lifelong war. And unfortunately, some plants were practically designed to start one. Let's start with a plant that many people plant deliberately, thinking it will make their yard beautiful, only to discover later that they may have just invited an underground army into their garden. A few years ago, a homeowner planted what seemed like the perfect privacy screen along the back of his property. Fast-growing, elegant, tall green stalks swaying in the wind. Within a single season, the screen looked amazing. Within 3 years, it had spread under the fence, across the yard, and into the neighbor's garden. That plant was running bamboo. At first glance, bamboo looks like a dream plant. It grows quickly, forms a lush wall of greenery, and gives instant privacy. But certain types, especially running bamboo varieties, spread through underground stems called rhizomes. These rhizomes can travel many feet through the soil in a single season. And they don't politely stay inside the space where you planted them. They move under fences, under patios, sometimes even under driveways. Gardeners often discover them when shoots suddenly appear 10 or 15 feet away from the original plant. Trying to remove them can turn into a long-term project because even small fragments left in the soil can regenerate new plants. That's why experienced gardeners usually recommend either planting clumping bamboo varieties or installing heavy underground barriers if you plan to grow running bamboo at all. This is the first lesson many gardeners learn too late. Some plants are not aggressive because they grow tall. They're aggressive because they spread where you cannot see them. And bamboo is just the beginning, because the next plant on our list is sitting in thousands of herb gardens around the world right now. People plant it for tea, for flavor, for its refreshing smell. But if you let it escape your container, it can quietly take over entire garden beds before you realize what's happening. Stick with me, because later we'll also talk about a plant that climbs houses, another that suffocates trees, and one that spreads so aggressively it has turned entire landscapes into single-species jungles. Let's talk about the innocent-looking plant that has quietly conquered more backyard gardens than almost any other herb. Mint. At first, mint seems like the perfect plant for a practical garden. It smells wonderful, it grows easily, it's useful for tea, cooking, and traditional remedies, and it's one of the few herbs that tolerates partial shade. You plant a little patch, and for a few weeks it behaves perfectly. But then something interesting starts happening underground. Mint spreads through creeping stems called runners. These runners travel just below the surface of the soil, sending up new shoots every few inches. And unlike many plants that slowly expand outward, mint moves fast, very fast. If conditions are right, a single mint plant can quietly fill an entire garden bed in one season. It slips between other plants, pushing them aside as it grows. Gardeners often notice the invasion when mint suddenly appears in places where they never planted it. It pops up beside tomatoes, around peppers, even in nearby lawn areas. Removing it can be frustrating because the roots break easily, and each remaining piece can grow into another plant. That's why experienced gardeners almost always grow mint in containers. A simple pot, a raised bed with a barrier, or even an old bucket buried in the ground can keep mint from escaping. It's not that mint is evil, it's just enthusiastic, very enthusiastic. And in a survival garden or food garden, enthusiasm without boundaries can become a real problem. But the next plant on this list isn't just enthusiastic. It's destructive enough that entire forests have been damaged by it, and it's still sold as an ornamental plant in some places because of how beautiful it looks when it blooms. There is a vine that many people plant for one simple reason. It grows fast. They want to cover a fence, or shade a pergola, or hide an ugly wall, and this plant promises to do exactly that. The problem is, it may not stop where you want it to. That plant is wisteria. When wisteria blooms, it's breathtaking. Long cascading clusters of purple or white flowers hang like chandeliers from the vines. Entire garden magazines have celebrated its beauty for decades. But certain species, especially aggressive Asian varieties, grow with extraordinary force. Wisteria vines don't just climb, they twist. As the vines grow thicker, they wrap tightly around anything they climb. Over time, those twisting stems can squeeze trees, fences, and even structural supports. In forests where aggressive wisteria escapes cultivation, it can climb into the canopy and block sunlight from reaching native plants below. Homeowners sometimes discover that their beautiful vine has quietly wrapped itself around gutters, railings, and nearby trees. Removing mature vines can be difficult because the woody stems become thick and heavy with age. This doesn't mean wisteria should never be planted. In some regions, native species like American wisteria are less aggressive and easier to manage. But it does mean gardeners should research the exact variety they're planting and be prepared to prune it regularly. Because a plant that grows fast enough to cover a house grows fast enough to overwhelm a garden if it's ignored. And that brings us to something even more surprising. A plant so charming and delicate-looking that many gardeners would never suspect it of being aggressive at all. Yet once it settles in your yard, it can quietly begin spreading through every corner of your lawn. Now let's talk about a plant that many people don't even realize they planted. It often appears as a gift from a neighbor, or it comes tucked inside a wildflower seed mix. Sometimes it simply shows up in the garden one spring, and the soft blue flowers look so charming that you decide to leave it. That plant is commonly known as periwinkle, also called creeping vinca. At first glance, it seems like the perfect ground cover. Glossy green leaves, delicate purple-blue flowers, and a thick carpet that fills empty spaces where grass refuses to grow. In shady corners of the garden, it looks almost magical, but creeping vinca spreads by sending out long trailing stems that root wherever they touch the soil. Each new rooted section becomes another plant, and over time the patch becomes thicker and thicker. That might sound useful, until it begins creeping beyond the spot where you planted it. In some regions, periwinkle has escaped from gardens into nearby woodlands. There it forms dense mats that block sunlight from reaching the forest floor, preventing native plants from growing. And once it forms those thick carpets, removing it becomes extremely difficult. The stems weave together, creating a living blanket that resists pulling. Gardeners who try to clear it often discover that tiny fragments left behind can regrow. This doesn't mean periwinkle is always a bad choice. In very controlled spaces, it can work as a low-maintenance ground cover. But the key word is controlled, because a ground cover that spreads aggressively can eventually become a permanent resident in places you never invited it. And if you think creeping plants are difficult to manage, wait until you meet the next kind. This one doesn't crawl along the ground, it climbs, and once it gets started, it can climb almost anything. Imagine planting a vine to decorate a fence. At first it grows slowly, just a few leaves, a few soft stems, but after a few years, the vine thickens, the leaves multiply, and suddenly the fence is completely covered in dense green foliage. The plant looks beautiful, almost like something from an old English garden. That vine is English ivy. For centuries, ivy has been used as an ornamental plant because it creates that classic look of green-covered walls and stone buildings. But when ivy escapes control, it can cause serious problems in a garden ecosystem. Ivy climbs by attaching tiny root-like structures to surfaces. These allow it to cling to trees, walls and fences as it climbs upward in search of sunlight. When ivy climbs trees, it can become so dense that it blocks light from reaching the tree's leaves. Over time, the added weight and reduced sunlight can weaken the tree. In some forests, large ivy infestations have contributed to tree decline and collapse during storms because the extra weight makes the trees more vulnerable to wind. And once ivy establishes itself, it spreads outward along the ground as well, forming thick mats that crowd out other plants. Removing mature ivy can be exhausting work. Gardeners often have to cut vines repeatedly and dig out root systems to keep it from returning. This is another reminder that a plant's beauty doesn't always reflect its behavior. Some of the most elegant plants in the garden can also be the most relentless. But the next plant we're about to discuss isn't just relentless. It has a strategy that is almost shocking once you understand it, because this plant doesn't just compete with its neighbors for sunlight or water. It actually releases chemicals into the soil that make it harder for other plants to survive nearby. And that little trick has allowed it to dominate landscapes in ways most gardeners never expect. Now we're going to talk about a tree that many gardeners once loved, until scientists discovered something surprising about how it behaves underground. The tree is commonly called black walnut. If you've ever seen one, you know why people plant them. They grow into tall, impressive shade trees. The nuts are edible and have been used in cooking for generations. In many rural areas, families have harvested them for decades. But black walnut has a hidden strategy for winning the competition in the forest. It produces a natural chemical compound called juglone. This compound is released from the tree's roots, leaves, and nut husks into the surrounding soil, and juglone can interfere with the growth of many other plants nearby. Gardeners sometimes notice the effect when vegetables struggle or fail to grow near a walnut tree. Tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, and several other common garden crops are known to be sensitive to juglone. In some cases, plants may grow poorly, wilt unexpectedly, or fail to thrive even when the soil and sunlight seem perfect. It's not that black walnut is evil. It's simply using a natural survival strategy called allelopathy, a process where plants release chemicals that influence the growth of neighboring plants. In a forest ecosystem, this can help the tree reduce competition, but in a backyard garden, it can quietly turn the soil around the tree into a difficult place for many crops to survive. That's why experienced gardeners usually keep vegetable beds well away from black walnut trees, or choose plant species known to tolerate juglone. And here's the interesting part. The next plant on our list spreads in a completely different way. Instead of releasing chemicals, it uses sheer speed. It grows so quickly that it can cover fields, forests, and abandoned land in just a few seasons. And once it starts spreading, stopping it can feel almost impossible. In the late 1800s, a vine was introduced into parts of North America for a very practical reason. Farmers were looking for a plant that could control erosion and stabilize soil on hillsides. At first, the plant seemed like a miracle. It grew rapidly, it covered bare ground, it protected soil from washing away during heavy rains. But within a few decades, something unexpected happened. The vine didn't stay where it was planted. It began spreading across fields, forests, and roadsides at astonishing speed. That plant is kudzu. You may have heard it called the vine that ate the South. Under warm conditions, kudzu can grow extremely fast during the summer months. Vines stretch across the ground, climb trees, and blanket entire landscapes in thick green growth. When kudzu climbs trees, it can form dense layers of leaves that block sunlight from reaching the tree below. Over time, the shaded trees may weaken and die. Entire hillsides in some regions have become covered in a continuous sheet of kudzu vines. Eradicating it is incredibly difficult. The root systems grow deep and store large amounts of energy, allowing the plant to regrow even after repeated cutting. This is a classic example of how a plant introduced for one helpful purpose can become a serious ecological problem when it spreads beyond control. And yet, even kudzu is not the plant that has caused the most concern for homeowners, because the final plant we're about to talk about is so aggressive that in some regions, property buyers are warned about it before purchasing a house. It can push through concrete. It can appear yards away from the original plant. And once it establishes itself, removing it can take years of determined effort. Imagine planting a decorative plant along the edge of your garden. It grows quickly. The leaves are large and lush. In summer, it produces sprays of creamy white flowers that look almost tropical. At first, it seems like the perfect ornamental. But then, the shoots begin appearing farther away, a few feet from the original plant, then 10 feet. Then 20. That plant is Japanese knotweed. Originally introduced to parts of Europe and North America in the 1800s as an ornamental plant, Japanese knotweed quickly revealed an extraordinary ability to spread. Like bamboo, it grows through underground rhizomes. But these rhizomes are extremely tough and persistent. Even tiny fragments left in the soil can grow into new plants. In some cases, the roots have pushed through cracks in pavement, retaining walls and building foundations. Because of this aggressive growth, certain mortgage lenders in the United Kingdom and other regions require property inspections for knotweed before approving home loans. Eradicating established knotweed often requires multiple years of treatment and careful removal. And yet, the real lesson here isn't just about one plant. It's about how easily a garden can turn into a long-term problem when we plant something without fully understanding how it behaves. Which brings us to the final part of this video. Because once you know what to avoid, you can start building a garden that actually gets easier over time instead of harder. Now that you've seen how some plants quietly take over gardens, forests, and even entire regions, let's step back and look at the bigger lesson, because this video isn't really about blaming plants. Plants are simply doing what they evolved to do. They spread, they compete, they survive. The real issue is what happens when a plant that evolved in one ecosystem suddenly appears in another, where nothing naturally keeps it in check. That's when a helpful garden plant can turn into a long-term battle. And for gardeners, especially those who want a peaceful, low-maintenance yard, the goal isn't to fight nature. The goal is to work with it. If you remember just a few simple principles, you can avoid most of the headaches we talked about today. First, always research a plant before you introduce it into your garden. Many plants that are harmless in one region can behave very differently in another climate. Agricultural extensions, local gardening groups, and native plant societies are excellent sources of reliable information for your specific area. Second, be cautious with plants known for aggressive spreading. Ground covers, vines, and fast-growing trees can be useful tools, but only when they are planted in places where their growth can be controlled. A vine on a sturdy trellis is very different from a vine allowed to climb trees. A ground cover in a bordered bed is very different from one planted near open woodland. And third, remember that a truly resilient garden usually relies on balance. Native plants, well-behaved perennials, and thoughtful spacing can create a garden that feeds pollinators, supports local wildlife, and still gives you beauty and food without constant struggle. Many experienced gardeners eventually move towards simpler systems. Fewer plants, but better chosen ones. Gardens that grow slowly, age gracefully, and require less work each year instead of more. And that might be the most valuable lesson of all, because the best garden isn't the one that grows the fastest. It's the one that still works for you 10 or 20 years from now, when your back isn't quite as strong and your time is more precious. So, here's a simple challenge for you today. Take a walk through your yard or garden and look closely at what's already growing there. Ask yourself one question: is this plant helping the garden or quietly taking control of it? If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about smart, resilient gardening, make sure you tap the like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever planted something that later became impossible to control? Also, let me know what country or region you're watching from. It's fascinating to see how different plants behave around the world.